Hello, welcome. I'm Samira Mehta. I'm the Director of Jewish Studies here at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I welcome you to this year's Holocaust Remembrance Day event, a lecture by Dr. Suzanne Brown-Fleming of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, entitled Love and Mercy After the Holocaust, the Vatican's Post-War Clemency Campaign, 1945 to 1958. Dr. Brown-Fleming spoke with faculty and students earlier today, and I can tell you that she is a wonderful and engaging speaker. Dr. Brown-Fleming joined USHMM in 2001 and directs special projects, particularly in the international realm, of large-scale cross-office museum projects that originate in the Mandel Center. Her work has been featured in Time Magazine, Catholic News Service, La Stampa, and Vatican News, which is the official news portal of the Vatican Holy See. She has appeared on CNN, Global Catholic Television Network, and in several documentaries. Her current research project, Il Papa Tedesco, the German Pope, Eugenio Pacelli, and Germany, 1917 to 1958, is a study of Pope Pius XII's relationship to Germany and its bishops, leaders, and people during the Weimar era, the Third Reich, and the Holocaust. Another current project, which I'm just gonna say in English, forgive me, Grandpa Was a Nazi, Edward Geist and the Crimes of the Third Reich, is Dr. Brown-Fleming's first attempt to research and write both as a decades-long scholar of the Holocaust and as the granddaughter of a devout and locally prominent Nazi. So we're in for, I'm not sure if treat is quite the word to use to discuss this material, but a really engaging and enriching lecture this evening. As so often is the case, the program in Jewish Studies has many to thank for making this evening's program possible. I would like to thank the Departments of History and Religious Studies for their co-sponsorship. I would also like to thank the David Schneer Fund for Community Programming, Public Scholarship, and the Arts, a fund named in honor of our beloved colleague and noted Holocaust scholar of European, Russian, and Jewish history, the late David Schneer. I would also like to thank Professor Thomas Peglow Kaplan for setting up this event during his year as the interim director of Jewish Studies, and our wonderful Jewish Studies staff, Felicia Naranjo Martinez and Maggie Rosenau, without whom we could do nothing around here. Of course, I would like to offer such thanks and welcome to Dr. Suzanne Brown-Fleming and to all of you for choosing to spend your evening with us tonight. Thank you so much, and welcome, Dr. Brown-Fleming.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. Can everybody hear me in the back? Okay, great. This is just an open-air playground. I got to spend a little time on the Flatirons today. It's really, wow. I've been made to feel very welcome. It's been really wonderful. In March 2019, His Holiness Pope Francis said, "The Church is not afraid of history, but rather she loves it." The Pope was speaking about opening the estimated 16 million pages of archival material for the pontificate of Pius XII, materials for the years 1939 to 1958. That is to say, the years during which Pius XII occupied the chair of St. Peter as head of the Vatican city-state and the Roman Catholic Church worldwide. These were the years of the Second World War and the Holocaust, 1939 to 1945, the murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others at the hands of the Nazi and Axis powers and their collaborators. Less discussed is the aftermath of the Holocaust, coinciding with the Cold War with the Soviet Union and its allies, already beginning by 1946 and carrying through the remainder of Pius XII's papacy. Also less discussed is the Vatican's post-war Clemency campaign for Germans indicted and convicted of war crimes, including, but not limited to, Holocaust atrocities, at 3 separate sets of trials. First, at the International Military Tribunal, a court established by the Allied powers in 1945 to prosecute Nazi criminals, war criminals. Second, the Nuremberg trials that went from 1946 to 1949, and in the so-called Dachau trials conducted by the US Army in the immediate post-war years. New archives shed light on this important post-Holocaust reckoning. Pius XII's special relationship with Germany is often mentioned as one factor in his decision-making during his tenure as nuncio, or papal diplomat, to Bavaria and Germany between the years of 1917 and 1929. He then became Secretary of State, the second most powerful position in the Holy See, the government of the Church, from 1930 to 1939. He was akin to a foreign minister, and finally as Pope. In a speech in June 1945, Pius XII rejected German collective guilt, the notion that all Germans collectively carried guilt for Nazi crimes. He called National Socialism a satanic ghost. He called for peace and brotherly understanding. In the eyes of the Pope and many others within the Catholic Church, such understanding should also be extended to Germans indicted and convicted for war crimes by Allied courts after the war's end. According to Pius XII's closest advisor, Giovanni Battista Montini, future Saint Pope Paul VI, it was the, quote, the constant practice of the Holy See, inspired by reasons of Christian piety, to work regardless of any fault in favor of those who'd been condemned to death. With access to the recently released Vatican archives, opened in March 2020, it is now possible to study this campaign in detail, including both public and private interventions, and it is also possible to study the correspondence revealing the motives and private exchanges between these men and their papal representatives in Germany and the United States. These exchanges reveal, among other motives and beliefs, a view that Jews were believed to be bent on revenge after the Holocaust and animated by they referred to as a Mosaic law of what was referred to as an eye for an eye in different letters. Allegedly, Jews were controlling the American military government and were responsible for the unjust sentences of these trials. Still a long way from the rejection of anti-Semitism in 1965 with the Second Vatican Council's Nostra Aetate Declaration, the immediate post-war years reveal the top-down, ugly underbelly of the Church's repeated calls for Christian love and mercy after the war. Pius XII, Montini, and Monsignor Domenico Tardini, the future Cardinal Secretary of State under Saint Pope John XXIII, formed the most powerful ruling body within the Vatican since the death of Pope Pius XI in 1939. From the Vatican, mostly behind the scenes and sometimes very publicly, this triumvirate intervened for Germans indicted and convicted for war crimes by Allied courts and incarcerated in occupied Germany's Landesberg and Spandau prisons post-war. In some cases, they intervened for war criminals extradited to and convicted by other nations, for example, Italy or Holland. Beyond the Secretariat of State, which is akin to the Foreign Ministry in Vatican City and its diplomatic outposts, this triumvirate regularly intervened and regularly turned to Amleto Giovanni Cardinal Cicognani, longtime power player, as nuncio to the United States, that's to say papal diplomat, from 1903 until 1959. And also, he too was a future Cardinal Secretary of State. under St. Pope Paul VI. These four men turned also to American-born Cardinal Aloysius Munch. Munch was the most powerful American Catholic figure, an influential Vatican representative in occupied Germany and subsequent West Germany between 1946 and 1959. Cardinal Munch held the diplomatic positions of the Apostolic Visitor, then Regent, and finally Pope Pius XII's nuncio, or official papal diplomat, to Germany. After being appointed Substitute Secretary of State in 1953, another man joined this group, Angelo Cardinal Dell'Acqua, became part of this powerful internal circle in discussions and debates over amnesty for Germans indicted and convicted for war crimes. On January 20th, 1949, in a memorandum found in the Vatican Apostolic Archive and marked sensitive in pencil, Tardini wrote to Kronberg, Germany, to the Chargé d'Affaires Opilio Rossi. I'm quoting now from the letter from Tardini to Rossi. It has been brought to the attention of this office that numerous Israelites, who for the most part returned to Germany with the Allied troops, and who sometimes occupy important positions in the governments of the occupation themselves, are engaged in activities that are often not without prejudice to Catholic interests, Tardini wrote. He continues, it is also stated that there is in these regions a not inconsiderable resurgence of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is hatred of Jews. I would be most grateful to the pontifical representation if it would inform me about this matter, also indicating the names of those who occupy important posts. This is where the letter ends, and this is somebody who is, under Pope Pius XII, he had two substitute secretaries of state. Montini was one, Tardini was the other, and these three men were the most powerful figures in the church. This was just one of regular discussions between Pacelli, Montini, and Tardini on this issue within that inner sanctum of the Secretariat. Tardini also wrote to Munch and included the memorandum he'd written to Rossi. So Tardini writes from Rome to Munch in Germany in the same vein that he had written to Rossi, also stationed in Germany. And a draft of that note can be found in a separate archive, the Holy See's Historical Archive of the Section for Relations with States. There are multiple new archives that have opened. Munch responded to Tardini and the Secretariat in a multi-page report that I won't quote the entirety of. I'll just try to give you the gist. Your Excellency, wrote Munch, owing to the press of work upon my return, is only now that I can give attention to your esteemed letter of January 20th, which arrived here February 2nd, 1949, and in which your Excellency makes inquiries about Jews who came to Germany upon the cessation of hostilities. Not many Jews entered with the army of occupation, nor did they at any time hold important positions in the army. Fortunately, a good number of officers of the highest ranks are Catholics. Munch then went on to clarify in the letter that the situation was different, in his view, in the American military government in Germany. In explaining this, Munch said, quote, while there are not many Jews in key positions, a large number held important positions on lower levels of administration where policies of occupation are implemented. And how would this have come to be? Munch explains further in this letter that I'm quoting him now, a great many of these Jewish Americans obtained their citizenship rank around 1938 and in the subsequent years. Fleeing from Hitler, when he came to power, they went to New York in large numbers rather than to London and Paris. After the required 5-year probation period in the United States, they took out their citizenship papers, and upon the close of the war, they volunteered for their services for work in Germany. Largely through influences in the Department of State, they obtained positions in various divisions of the military government for which they were accepted chiefly because they read and spoke German as Germans. In fact, many I met or heard spoke a broken English. And then that's the close of that letter, and in a separate letter he writes, quote, "In the spirit of centuries-old traditions, the Church seeks to have justice tempered with mercy." This is a letter from Munch to General Thomas Handy, Commander-in-Chief of the United States European Command, on February 27, 1950. And here Munch wrote, actually at the behest of the triumvirate I talked about earlier, "In accord with the time-honored prerogative of the Church to intercede for even the worst of criminals, Pope Pius XII respectfully requests clemency be shown." Now, the discussion within the Secretariat of State was a different one and much less noble. On April 21st, 1950, Munch wrote to Tardini with an update on his most recent meeting with American Governor John J. McCloy on April 18th. McCloy was the U.S. High Commissioner for Germany from 1949 to 1952. In January 1951, he issued the controversial Landsberg Report. Out of 28 prisoners condemned to death, 7 death sentences were confirmed and the rest were commuted. On that April day in 1950, in his meeting with Munch, McCloy confessed to struggling with resurgent anti-Semitism in Germany, specifically what Munch described as the desecration of Israelite, as is the word that was used in the document, cemeteries, perpetuated recently in several German cities, most recently Frankfurt am Main. McCloy said to Munch that such facts were actually doing great harm to the reputation of Germany, and said, in fact, he was sorry to had to have observed that the German police had shown itself unable to respond to these anti-Semitic incidents, and his work was made more difficult. Munch reported that McCloy then said very, very clearly, "There are groups in the United States who do not like the Germans. Indeed, they hate them. They therefore highlight these events in order to use them to inflame public opinion against the Germans." Munch recorded that McCloy in particular mentioned the American Jewish Congress and the Society to Prevent World War III. The latter, McCloy is to have said, promotes a policy of hatred and conflict among its communist members. Munch continued in his documenting this meeting, "These two organizations, to Mr. McCloy's knowledge, led a number of senators to request President Truman to establish a commission to review American policy in Germany. He well realizes such a commission, far from facilitating his task, would only increase the difficulties and stumbling blocks on the road to improvement in Germany." Now to bring us back to Vatican City. The Holy See's Secretariat of State entertained petitions on behalf of indicted and convicted war criminals well into the late 1950s. One such petition came to Pius XII from a Protestant pastor and former military chaplain, one Herr Friedrich Ronnenberger, who lived in Wilhelmshaven, Germany. The request was relayed to Munch via Father Johannes Landwehr, also living in Wilhelmshaven, with the intention that Munch bring it forward to the Holy Father. The petition was on behalf of Spandau prisoner Erich von Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy until his resignation and retirement in May 1943. As the conduit for the plea, Munch responded to Father Landwehr with a message from the Pope to be conveyed to Ronnenberger. In this November 1953 message, response to Father Landwehr, Munch stressed the Holy Father's message should be conveyed in a verbal and appropriate form during a personal visit. First, the letter to the Holy Father has reached its highest destination, Munch was to convey. Second, the Secretary of State of His Holiness has again considered with all attention the request presented, he added. But he continued, having already taken steps in the preceding years to obtain a pardon or relief for detention of Grand Admiral Raeder from the highest competent authorities, the Holy See unfortunately sees no possibility of repeating them. After all, noted Munch, the power of command over Spandau prisoners does not rest with the Western Allies alone. All earnest efforts so far have unfortunately had to remain unsuccessful. The Holy See deeply regrets that hard limits have been set to its helpfulness in this case. Munch finished with a request that Father Ronenberger follow up once this message had been conveyed. The November 1953 exchange was more than an exchange of niceties and sympathies. Pope Pius XII and his office tried to intervene at the highest levels. By that time, he was substitute Secretary of State, and he advised, the Holy See has just invoked the interest of the German Federal Chancellor in the painful situation that Konstantin von Neurath and Admiral Raeder find themselves in Spandau prisons. Who is Konstantin von Neurath? He had served as foreign minister under the Nazi regime and was tried and sentenced based on his role as the Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia. It seems that they are old and exhausted and in very poor health, Delacroix wrote to Munch. It is feared that Mr. von Neurath can no longer survive in prison. The federal chancellor should therefore intercede with the administrative powers to obtain the two above-mentioned prisoners' clemency. The bodies of these two prisoners, should they die in Spandau prison, should be returned to their personal friends and relatives. And Munch was to bring this matter to the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. We don't know whether he did so. That is not in the folder. Who were these personal friends so well disposed in German society so as to have access to Munch and figures like the Chancellor and President of the Federal Republic of Germany? One was former German Field Marshal Albert von Kesselring, or Smiling Albert, as he was nicknamed. He was the commander for the entire Mediterranean during the war. And among other deeds, he successfully ordered and executed the German capture of Rome in September 1943. On July 21st, 1958, 13 years after the end of the war, Delacroix reported to Munch that the former Field Marshal Kesselring addressed the Holy Father in a letter begging him to intervene with the President of the Italian Republic for the liberation of the Austrian SS Major Walter Raeder and for Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Kappler. Anybody who's been to Rome knows these names. The unit under Raeder's command committed the Vinca and Marzabetto massacres in Italy in August and September of 1944, ordering the execution of 2,700 Italian civilians in Tuscany during the so-called anti-partisan sweeps. Herbert Kappler was tried by an Italian military tribunal in 1948 and sentenced to life in prison for his role in the Ardeatine Caves massacres of 335 Italian citizens, including Jews, on March 24, 1944. On November 7, 1957, Munch wrote to Delacroix, on the part of a well-deserving Catholic deputy of the federal parliament, a fervent prayer has been addressed to the nunciature to obtain renewed interest of the Holy See in favor of Kappler. This was a bridge too far. Delacroix responded in 1957 that the apostolic nuncio in Italy, who did bring the matter to the attention of Italian authorities, was told that a very high-ranking personality declared that the political assessment of Kappler as an enemy of Italy has not changed, and even the visit of the federal chancellor from Germany would not make a difference. To conclude, so that we have time for discussion, I could give you a lot more examples, but they're sort of twisted. To conclude, Jewish victims of the murderous Nazi regime received little empathy from their Catholic neighbors. And sometimes, at the root of this, was a 2,000-year-old tradition of anti-Semitism, or hatred of Jews. One writer in the late 1940s, hoping for clemency for Ernst von Weizsäcker, German ambassador to the Holy See during the occupation of Rome and the 1943 roundup of Roman Jews, recounted the nativity narrative of the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verses 16 to 18. In this particular biblical passage, Herod the Great, king of Judea, ordered the execution of all male children under 2 years old. Referencing this passage, the writer pleaded, quote, "When Herod in days gone by was busily plotting to murder the children of Bethlehem, he concealed this plan behind a foreign mask and did his best to turn the unsuspecting 3 wise men into unwitting scouts. In the same way, his modern imitators today move heaven and earth to conceal their real purpose from the masses and make them unconscious tools of their intentions." He's referring to the Jewish people in his view. So this was the kind of atmosphere in those first post-war years in which the Secretariat of State of the Vatican operated and made decisions. One can draw tentative conclusions. I would still, make them with hesitancy, as many more years of work in these new archives and evaluated against material in other archives will surely continue to broaden our perspective. Further, the impact of negative views about Jews was but one among many factors that entered into a centuries-old policy of Vatican neutrality or impartiality. It would be myopic to understand the Vatican's clemency campaign only in light of lingering anti-Semitism, present as it was. Factors like the Cold War, gratitude on the part of Pope Pius XII for avoiding harm to Vatican and church property during the German occupation of Rome from 1943 to 1944, a desire to bring back Nazified Catholics to the flock by expressing sympathy for them and with them, and latching on to an anti-Allied campaign very popular in post-war Germany, played all major roles as well. Hard political realities meant making decisions barely discernible as decisions made as Christ's vicar on earth. Declining influence undergirded what Juliana Chalmades has called a 20th century crusade to remake Christian Europe. But it is striking that the Vatican neutrality or impartiality was abandoned in the case of German war criminals. Empathy, mercy, and repeatedly cited Christian charity for Germans after the Holocaust was a policy for Pope Pius XII, and his closest advisors gave directives to carry it out. Suspicion, fear, and centuries-old anti-Jewish tropes about Judaism as a religion that stood for an eye did not end after 1945. Based on these documents, there's reason to think this widespread sentiments were shared by decision makers in the Secretariat of State and by extension the Pope himself. The sea change that would come with the Second Vatican Council in the mid-1960s was still decades away. Thank you, and sorry, that's a first for me. Throwing up in the middle of a speech is definitely a new one. So, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I also understand that these documents are from, sort of after the fall of the Nazi regime. Mm-hmm. But I'd love to understand sort of, this is from the sort of, Vatican side of this. I'd love to understand whether you, based on your knowledge of sort of seeing a sort of Nazi era anti-Semitism and the sort of the politics that and like interpersonal communication that in which it is like proliferated as distinct from sort of Roman Catholic anti-Semitism, or whether, because I don't, as someone who's not a scholar of this, but who like sort of got this typical American education on the Holocaust as like a young Jewish person, sort of don't typically associate the motivations of the Nazi regime with Christianity or with Roman Catholicism in particular. And so I'd love to understand if you have any insights into that.
Yeah, it's a long, kind of entangled historical story. Antagonism towards the Jewish people was part of Catholic teaching and tradition for 2,000 years. And and sometimes the way I think of this question, which is an excellent question, is the Holocaust occurred on a Christian continent, almost a fully Christian continent. So, and most people were educated in a non-secular system. So I think that we have to consider that these negative teachings about Jews were a part of the atmosphere that enabled millions and millions of ordinary people to participate as soldiers or bureaucrats confiscating property, or lawyers promulgating new laws, or neighbors who didn't look anymore at their Jewish families they'd known for a decade. Suddenly they stopped looking at them on the streets, and I would say that Christian anti-Judaism helped to make what happened possible. Now, it's interesting you make the distinction, because we were just talking at the colloquium. In 1998, the Vatican issued a document called We Remember, and it acknowledged this 2,000-year history of anti-Jewish teaching, but it very carefully said, when World War II and the Holocaust arrived in the narrative of this document, the Vatican made a clear distinction between racial anti-Semitism, you are a Jew based on your blood, versus, and said that racial anti-Semitism was the reason for the Holocaust. And it's true that in reading papers and the views of so many Catholics at the time, the bishops across Germany, the ones that I would know the most about, and Italy, did reject racial anti-Semitism, because if you receive the sacrament of baptism, you are Catholic, whatever your creed, color, or any other factor. So, but usually in these explanations I was saying today, there would be of course we're against racial anti-Semitism and we don't agree with the Nazi regime on this, but we understand why one must be warned about the Jewish people and their secularism, or their Talmud, or their capitalism, or their communism, or their terrible morals. So, I mean, I met a professor here today who had a grandparent die in Auschwitz. I'm pretty sure this person's grandparent wasn't thinking, standing on the ramp, I wonder which type of anti-Semitism got me. So I sometimes think it's a debate that's meant to deflect responsibility. That's my personal interpretation of it. It's a really tricky thing, because I was raised in Catholic schools. I didn't hear any of these stereotypes that I read about all the time. I didn't hear any of them, but I also didn't hear anything positive about Jews or Judaism either. So that's another kind of legacy. So there's a lot of work to be done. I do think that Catholic-Jewish relations are at the best they've probably ever been. That is for sure. I think that the Pope, all popes since John the 23rd have understood and have continued to realize and accept that this is something that will always be a Catholic priority. So it's just complicated. It's a really great question. But even as late as, even in World War II, and especially in some parts of Europe, say Poland or Ukraine or Russia, you still saw things like the blood libel, where a villager and somebody, a peasant who may not have been able to read or write, knew that, oh, if you're Jewish, you killed my God, and therefore I won't shelter you or hide you, or I'll call the neighbors on you. So all of these stereotypes were alive and well during the Holocaust. Kind of a long answer. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your presentation. I'd like to go one step deeper,
Okay.
lower down, because you're talking about the high-level Nazis. What about the middle-level Nazis? I have heard, it's been alleged, I'm no scholar on this at all, that the Catholic Church played a major role in allowing or helping middle-level, lower-level Nazis escape Europe and end up in places like Argentina, Eichmann, for example. Could you, in reading through the archives, as you've done, would you comment on whether that was a definite policy of the church or whether this just happened?
That is one of the huge questions in Holocaust studies that we're really hoping that the new archives will answer. What we knew before 2020 was that certain religious houses in Rome did indeed shelter Nazis, help them to get Catholic identity cards so that they could go to the Red Cross and request refugee status so that they could get on a ship to Argentina or Paraguay or Syria or a number of countries. What we have to figure out and sort out is these individual actors who are heads of their religious houses. The most famous is Alois Hudal, the Austrian priest who ran the German Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome. Did they have permission from their boss, which was Montini, number 2 in the entire hierarchy? Did they, certainly it was known that this was happening because eventually Hudal, for example, was stopped. But what were the discussions inside the inner sanctum of the Vatican's Secretary of State? Did they say, we don't agree with this, we do, oh, now the press is bad press, we have to put a stop to this. We don't know what the connection between future Saint Pope Paul VI, who was the head of the Pontifical Assistance Commission for Aid to Refugees, and that was the vehicle by which these war criminals escaped. Did he know about it, or when did he know about it? What did he say and do about it? So, to be continued. I'm actually doing a documentary, or I'm in a documentary to be filmed in Rome in a couple of weeks on this question, so.
Now going to turn to a question from the online audience.
Yes, and apologies, online audience, for the brief.
Well, not at all. Okay, so here's from Emma Consiglio. Incredible lecture, and thank you for speaking today. One question for you: how did the Jewish community after World War II react to the Vatican's acts and policies that appear to provide clemency to former Nazis, particularly in terms of moral and political implications? Were there any major replies or criticism from Jewish groups or leaders during that time? Thank you.
So mixed into that question actually is the founding of the State of Israel in I always get it wrong. It's 1947, 1948. 1948, and this is something that Israel was not recognized by the Vatican for several decades, and the question of that the question of how I'm going somewhere with this, how contemporary Jews of the time felt about Pius XII, it was mixed. Pius XII did get some public accolades for the hundreds, at least hundreds, maybe up to thousands of Jews that were hidden in different convents and religious houses in Rome and in France and in Belgium and in other places. But these public figures also were trying to get recognition for the state of Israel, so it was complicated. And rescue was real. Some Jewish people were rescued and owe their lives to a Catholic rescuer. So, and others have been deeply critical. I can tell you that in Rome itself, the Roman Jewish community and the Vatican have always had a tense relationship because on October 16th, 1943, when SS rounded up over 1,000 Jews in the heart of Rome, they were taken to a military college that is maybe 1 kilometer away from the Vatican itself. And the Pope was made aware of this roundup within hours of its start. And he decided, he did make some efforts to pull out Catholic baptized people who had been rounded up by mistake, but the convoy left for Auschwitz 2 days later. And this was a blow to the Roman Jewish community. And in a diplomatic discussion on that day, the number 2, Malioni was his name, and the German ambassador von Weizsäcker, who we briefly mentioned, had a discussion where the Pope's representative said, "We're not happy about this. It's happening under our very windows. The Holy Father's not happy about this." And the response of the German ambassador was, "Well, would you like me to take your complaint to Adolf Hitler when this is his direct wish? You've done so well, staying neutral so far. Do you really want me to do that?" And the response of the Vatican ambassador was, no, we can keep this a private discussion. You do what you think is best. So that wound has not healed. It's very rare for the chief rabbi of Rome and the cardinal secretary of state to agree to be on the same podium. There's suspicion, but there's hurt that Roman Jews were there before any Christians were in Rome, and that they were also sacrificed. It doesn't sit so well. So, on the other hand, things are better. The Catholic-Jewish relations are better than they've probably ever been. So it's a mixed bag.
Another question from the live audience.
I see all the way in the back.
Oh, I'm coming with the microphone.
First of all, you are a rock star for your little side thing and getting back and finishing. I'm curious what your experience was being in the Vatican archives. Like, this is, to me, this is deeply shameful stuff that I imagine a lot of people would just like to leave in a drawer. So when you're there, are people helpful? Are they resistant? Like, what's it like actually interacting with this raw information?
Yeah, there are a couple of ways to answer that. From the perspective of like a geeky historian, it's super cool because they're not digitized material. They're not digital. They're actually still the paper. So I'll give a real life example of what you have to do to see one of the documents that I quoted from. You have to apply to the prefect, who's usually he's definitely a religious, usually a bishop or a Monsignor, sometimes an archbishop. You have to give your credentials, that you have some kind of degree that shows that you're a legitimate researcher in their view. Then you have to travel to Rome, and you have to you go through the St. Anna Gate for the Vatican Apostolic Archive, and there's a Swiss guard who checks. I should have brought my ID. You have to have a specific ID. He checks your ID and then waves you to the next Swiss guard who also checks your ID, and then the third kind of place to cross, it's a policeman. So this is before you ever get to the door. And then when you get to the door, which is thousands of years old and actually super cool, then there are more checks, and you're closely watched in the archive. I mean, if you're not up to any monkey business, you don't mind being closely watched, but it is really cool that you're looking at documents from the 1940s and the person next to you is working on a 12th century manuscript, and it's the artwork is incredible. And so it's, from that perspective, it's a really cool experience. What we at the Holocaust Museum are hoping to do and have been working on doing is democratizing the research experience a little more, in the sense that not everybody can get to Rome, not everybody passes the test. Not everybody can do that, and so wouldn't it be great to look at scans of those materials alongside hundreds of millions of other pages in our reading room in Washington, D.C. and Bowie, Maryland. So that's what we've been working on the last 5 years. We have over 500,000 digital scans so that researchers can just do their work a little more easily. You do feel like you're in a Dan Brown novel at times. I was just talking about with colleagues at the colloquium how my last trip to Rome 2 weeks ago, we ended up in a cave directly underneath one of the Vatican's major buildings, looking at old names and artifacts from the 1940s. So it can still be, I mean, scorpions and all. It was really crazy. So it's still... And your bigger question of the shameful nature of some of the things you find in the archive, there are also hopeful stories too. In the end, the Catholic figures in the Catholic Church, from the Pope down to the person who goes to church on Sunday, they behaved in every human spectrum of behavior. There were rescuers, there were killers, there was everything in between, as you'd expect from any human being and any human institution. And I think that it's been very smart and heartening for a practicing Catholic like myself to have the Pope say, let's be transparent, let's let researchers do their work and not try to articulate the narrative. I think that's very positive. Sometimes the stuff I read really fills me with rage. But at least I'm allowed to read it now, and we are talking about it tonight. So.
And another question from the online audience.
Okay, this one's a short one from Federico Beltrame. What's the relationship between these new documents and Odessa?
Odessa is a reference to what this gentleman was asking about earlier, the so-called rat line, the escape of Nazi and Axis war criminals through religious houses in Italy, all across Italy, not just in Rome, to South America. And where we are looking in these new archives, there's something called the Pontifical Assistance Commission, huge, massive, Vatican-sponsored organization for relief of Catholic refugees. It was established in 1944. And this is the agency by which Catholic refugees would receive assistance to build new lives after the war. And what what men like Alois Hudal, who I mentioned, the Austrian bishop at the Anima, he said, well, if somebody came to me and said they were Paul Stangl, not Franz Stangl, the commandant of one of the extermination camps called Treblinka, who was I to question, how was I to know he was a war criminal? And we were not in the digital age yet, and it was very hard to, in millions and millions of refugees swimming around Europe and trying to figure things out, and things happening quickly and on the fly, it wasn't easy always to identify who was a war criminal and who was not. On the other hand, we know that these networks in Italy, they officially tried to help war criminals, and they did know sometimes when it's Paul Stangl at your, Franz Stangl at your door and not Paul Stangl. So we're still looking, and it's kind of hard to find the stuff. A couple of scholars who know a lot about this have been in the Vatican archives since 2020, and we haven't still figured out what's the relationship between these individual priests and actors across Italy who facilitated the rat line and the leadership in the Vatican. I don't think we have a definitive answer yet on that.
So I think, out of respect for the fact that you are on Eastern time and out of care for altitude sickness, we're gonna close here.
there's
We're gonna
one
take
more.
one final
Yeah.
question, and then that will be it. But
In the announcement, it mentioned something about Oswald Pohl.
Yes.
And I just don't understand how they could offer clemency,
for the audience online, we need the microphone.
the clemency for Oswald Pohl, who was the head of the SS construction and concentration empire. how could they make a case and what was the result?
Actually, that's a super interesting story. Oswald Pohl, as you said, he was a major Nazi war criminal responsible for the labor and concentration camp system across Europe. When he went to prison, I think he was tried in one of the Nuremberg successor trials. He converted to Catholicism, and he wrote a book about his way to God, I think was the title, My Way to God. And he convinced the prison chaplain, Catholic Father Karl Morgenschweiss, that he was reformed and he was sorry for all of what he had done. He had been sentenced to death, and when John J. McCloy did the clemency that I mentioned for 1951, Pohl did not get clemency. Pohl he ended up being executed in June. But the April before, a couple of months before, a scandal broke out because Catholic Oswald Pohl asked the Pope, Pius XII, for a blessing at the hour of death. This is a specific Catholic tradition where anyone, no matter what kind of crime that they've committed, can get a pardon from the Holy Father. This was transmitted to Pius XII, probably through Morgenschweiss and other channels, and Pius XII did it. He did send a cable with offering the pardon at the hour of death. And this got out in the news in Munich and created a big scandal. And Munch, who we've talked about a lot, was reporting on the response in Germany and in Rome, and saying, look, he was a good Catholic. He truly was sorry, and the Pope was only doing what he would have done for any person of Catholic faith who asked, and was completely. I mean, the principle is, and this was the public discussion when Pius XII or his two top officers were speaking with American military brass. The official discussion was, in the Catholic Church, love and mercy are what guide us, and we forgive the sins of anyone who's truly sorry, no matter what the sin. And we advocate for anyone, no matter what they've done, if they're truly sorry for their sin, and we offer them the Catholic sacraments. And all of this, if that had really been the whole story, I think it would be easier to swallow than when you read the documents and you see, they're still afraid that Jews rule the world in 1949 when 6 million are dead. They're saying thank you to the occupying authorities of Germany for not bombing Vatican City. And they're trying to get back all those Nazified Catholics who left and now want to come back, and they don't want to feel judged. So it was not only, that's why you can't be an effective chair of St. Peter and the moral authority of billions of people and a head of a city-state at the same time. One role will beat out the other.
Thank you so much. We have one final question that came in from
Sure.
online. Do you have it in you?
Of course, yeah. I feel better now that I threw up everywhere.
We're very sorry again. It's a little off topic, but obviously related. So it's from Ivan Schaefer. And the question is, what was the Vatican's official reasons for not recognizing statehood of Israel in 1948? It's not quite your topic, but you might be able to respond.
Well, I will say that I'm not an expert on this, but what little I do know, I mean, Jerusalem is a holy site for multiple religions. And of course, many major religions would like to control Jerusalem and think of it as a place where there is very holy for their traditions. So in an era where Jews were not, where anti-Semitic teachings about Jews were negative in an official way in 1948. This was church canon. This was practice in schools. That didn't change until 1965. So it would have been natural for the Pope to dislike the idea of a Jewish state that had control over the holy site of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. So it would have been actually unusual had he not taken that position at that time.
Thank you again so very much for joining us tonight. Please join me in offering our thanks to Dr. Suzanne Brown-Fleming. We have a few other thanks to offer. So I would just like to offer thanks to the University Library for the space, again to the David Schneer Fund for Community Programming, Public Scholarship, and the Arts, the Departments of History and Religious Studies, to Dan, whose last name I have tried for 5 years to learn how to pronounce, to Third Harmonic Live Productions, to Danya Rivlin and Eyal Rivlin, whose music you heard at the beginning of our program, and once again to the Jewish Studies staff, Felicia and Maggie. And we would like to let you know about some upcoming events that we have. We will have a speaker. We're co-sponsoring with the Singer Chair on February 6th. We have been lied to, how anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, and misogyny are linked. On February 11th, back here in this room, I believe, an embodied Judaism presentation on Jews of color in the United States and Israel. On March 3rd, our Bender lecture. Laura Liebman, who is currently the president of the Association for Jewish Studies, Once We Were Slaves, the extraordinary journey of a multiracial Jewish family. Our annual Shmooza-Palooza, celebrating our Hebrew program on March 12th. On April 2nd, the third lecture in our Israel-Palestine series, which Israel-Palestine is co-sponsoring Embodied Judaism. Wadid Said, who is from our own law school here at CU. On April 7th, we will have a conference honoring David Schneer of blessed memory, and there will be a public program here on Monday night. And then there will be a public reading of names on Yom HaShoah, April 24th. Again, put on by the Singer Chair in Jewish History, our own Professor Pegalo Kaplan. I hope to see you at some or all of these events. Stay warm, everyone. Drive home safely.